Good evening, everyone, again. Thank you so much for joining me for part 2 of our look at the Jews of Hungary. We will be moving forward today, considering and keeping in the back of our minds what we learned last week and the whole beginnings of Jewish life in Hungary. Tonight we're going to have a little bit more evidence in our hands to play with, as we do always as we move forward. So I will be looking at the following this evening. First of all, we will consider the Jews under the Habsburg rule, highlighting the late 15th century creation of a Jewish prefect and his role. Remember last time we found that there were 2 Christian prefects. Finally, there's a sense, and this is something that the Jewish community will push for, to have their own prefect in charge of themselves in Hungary. Then we're going to consider what information we have on Jewish women, because I haven't really spoken much about Jewish women. We had that little niche that we saw that women would look through, but we need to know more about them. And I'm going to turn to the remarkable case of Shlomo Schneur Zalman of Buda, a Jewish courtier who converted to Christianity, yet continued to advocate for the Jewish community, his former Jewish community. And finally, I'm going to finish by discussing the division of Hungary between the Ottomans, the Royal Hungary, and Transylvania, which we will see happens towards the end of our session tonight. So let's start at the beginning of the 15th century. How are our Jews doing? How are they protecting themselves? Well, for more than 100 years already, Jewish delegates of the different communities of Hungary met at conferences from time to time, electing spokesmen among themselves and laying the foundations, if not of a countryside-wide Jewish organization, at least of common action in the court in the name of Hungarian Jewry. And one of the most important activities of this first countryside Jewish conference at the end of the 14th century was to seek reaffirmation of the old, almost entirely forgotten 1251 Jew law of King Beller IV. Our Jews become historians of their own history in Hungary. And the memory that there had been a law survived among the Jews. They'd heard that it had granted them certain rights and certain privileges, but they had neither the original nor official copies of it in their possession, and they did not even know that it had been issued by King Beller IV. They found out that an original copy of the document had been kept in the archives of Székesfehérvár, a city in central Hungary, in the church chapter, and entrusted a Jew named Solomon, who resided in that city, to request that the king provide the Jews with an authorized copy of this document. And one can assume, of course, that Solomon's petition was not submitted without a substantial, sizable present accompanying it. You know, I think about how often I go into an archive, I only have a certain amount of time. I quickly need to photocopy something and bring it home so that I can use it and look at it at leisure. This is about going into an archive in the early, late medieval times and looking for this initial, original document. King Sigismund, who's the king at the time, he consented, and in 1396 instructed the chapter of Székesfehérvár to search for and find this letter in question, and to issue an authorized copy of it, which meant it had to obviously all been written down. This is way before the time of the printing press, to Solomon and other Jews living in the kingdom to, quote, for the purpose of acquiring their rights, the rights of Jews that had already been given in 1251. And in places where the Jewish community could not produce the authenticated copy of the 1251 privileges, the cities blithely ignored their existence. So it was really important for the Jews to establish, we have a history here, we have a document from 1251 that proves that we have the protection of the king. But the significance of the wide availability of this old letter of privilege was that in accordance with its provisions, it was proof that the Jews were subject not to the jurisdiction and power of the cities, but directly to the king or to his appointed representative. And this meant that local laws and statutes aimed at narrowing the rights of the citizens had no legal consequences on the Jews or their privileges. But for every new king, as I mentioned last time, the Jews still worried about how they would be protected. Would they be strong enough financially to satisfy his demands and thus secure his protection? After Sigismund, Albert II of Habsburg reigned over Hungary for the short period of 2 years, from 1437 to 9. And like his long-lived predecessor, Albert also accorded the Hungarian Jews much better treatment than the Jews of Austria and Germany, who were subject to him as well in his capacity as Duke of Austria, King of Bohemia, and King of Germany. For example, under his rule, the Jews of Vienna were wrongfully accused in 1420 of having ritually killed 3 Christian children, and a horrific number of 300 Jews were burnt to death before the bodies of the 3 children who had drowned in the river were found. Yet this same monarch manifested no enmity towards the Jews of Hungary. And one cannot assume that Sigismund and Albert had greater sympathy for Hungarian than for, say, Austrian or German Jews. And I think the difference seems to hinge on some experience that these monarchs had had in Hungary that convinced them that they could obtain greater financial advantages from the Jews by enabling them to live peacefully without persecution by either the authorities or the people. There is no other way to explain this. The Jews contributed more to the royal treasure in Hungary than in the neighboring countries, and the kings knew that any bodily or financial harm to them would diminish their ability to maintain this flow of taxation. And if we think back to our previous lecture, when I mentioned that Lajos the Great had expelled the Jews of Hungary in 1360 and then recalled them 4 years later, evidently this short period was sufficient to make him aware that without Jews, the money economy of the country and the treasury revenues suffered a serious decline. So now let us turn to this position of the Jewish prefect as another example of the Jews protecting themselves. Last time, I mentioned these 2 non-Jews who sat in judgment over the Jews. Now we have a Jew in this high office in Hungary, requested, of course, by the Jews themselves. The Jews want to have somebody in control of them who is Jewish and will favor them when it comes to judicial protection. It was created by King Matthias Corvinus. He ruled between 1458 and 1490, and he's remembered in Hungary as a great Renaissance king. Matthias fulfilled the Jews' request because he was of the opinion that only a person well versed in the affairs of the Jews could determine and allocate the taxes in accordance with the Jews' ability to pay. And he repeatedly pressed the Jews financially. In fact, the data shows that during his rule, the Jews of Hungary actually experienced an economic decline, but the tenor of his reign was such that no breach against their security was ever attempted. And the Jewish prefect became of great importance in the life of the Hungarian Jews for more than half a century. So let's look a little bit closer at these Jewish prefects. The position of a Jewish prefect meant that in the royal court, for the first time in Hungarian history, a high Jewish official represented the country's Jews and was responsible for them in every possible aspect. And this position provided the Jews with greater personal, legal, and financial security and resulted in more settled conditions in their internal affairs as well. Obviously, the Jewish prefect had to live in the capital, in Buda. He had to be near the king, he had to have free access to him, to obtain direct instructions, and to present Jewish complaints and grievances to him directly. The Jewish prefect participated in all the festive official occasions of the court, and he appeared on horseback in ceremonial processions, wearing arms and accompanied by a contingent of similarly armed horsemen, as you can see in this picture. The Jews, by the way, are on the left of the picture, and I will talk about them and what they're holding in a moment. To all appearances, this Jewish judge was a magnet of the realm. He was also master over all the Jews of the kingdom. He had armed contingents at his disposal to help him enforce his decisions. In Buda, he even had a jail house of his own where he could imprison Jews who were guilty of a criminal offense or who had failed possibly to pay their taxes that had been imposed upon them. The jail house also served as this safe deposit where valuable objects left as pledges in the hands of Jewish moneylenders were kept. And in case that there arose between a Jew and a Christian, the lawsuit was adjudicated by a jury consisting of both Christians and Jewish jurors, and it was the task of local Jewish judges who worked underneath the main judge to pass sentence. And we actually have details about the lives and the works of the Jewish prefects whose influence with the crown made Jewish life less onerous in the 15th and 16th centuries. They were the members of the Mendel dynasty. The first Jewish prefect was a man named Judah Mendel, who seems to have officiated from 1476 or soon thereafter to his death in 1482. So it was a lifelong position. Prior to his appointment, he had been the head of the Jewish community of Buda. Jacob Mendel I was appointed Jewish prefect after his father's death and is first mentioned as holding the office in a 1482 document, and he served until 1502. After him, the honor was inherited by 5 more of the Mendel family. And all in all, therefore, 7 Mendels served, as you can see, as Jewish prefects. Before we leave the Mendels, I want to tell a short story about how the original Judah Mendel was given an important role in the royal wedding of 1476 between King Matthias, that I mentioned before, and his bride, Beatrix, at the Buda fortress. Hungarian royal chroniclers record how Judah Mendel headed a mounted contingent of Jewish dignitaries that were among the cavalry troops riding out to receive the royal groom. Yet there was another procession of the Jews at this time. And I think this one is more interesting, and we can interpret it better than the chronicler. So I will read you from the text. I forgot to mention another procession, this Hungarian royal chronicler writes, in which the Jews rode out to greet the queen before the gates of the city of Buda. From first there arrived 32, all dressed in violet garments, decorated with silver ornaments, except that these also carried a great banner, and on it was written in gold letters in Hebrew, Shema Yisrael, which is to say, "Hear, children of Israel," And on this flag was also an escutcheon displaying a witch's foot, the arms of King David, and 3 golden stars surmounted by a Jew's hat. Now, many scholars have tried to work on what that actually is. Is it some sort of banner, some sort of emblem? And all of this in gold and surrounded by a gold border. Let me go on. This is the interesting part. Behind the banner went on foot, young and old, in ranks of 2, more than 150 of them, wearing on their heads hoods of silk and damask. And they sang a chant with loud voices, and they carried a canopy. And an old Jew walked under the canopy, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth, to which was affixed a golden tablet. And 2 Jews were leading him. And they made a short speech to the queen. Then the king and queen together approached on their mounts, and as they came to the canopy, the Jews opened the bundle and offered it to the queen to kiss, but she did not wish to kiss it. So what was in that bundle that the Jews had presented to the king and queen, of which she did not wish to kiss? Well, the document is showing, as you see very clearly here in this image, they were offering the queen a Torah scroll, as medieval Jews actually often did for any coronation, and particularly one of the most fascinating times that the Jews do this is actually for the coronation of a new pope, that the Jews would give or would present a new Torah scroll that they had written to show that they, as a gift to whoever is now in power, to show them that he is holding their precious law in his hands. It was an act that manifested the Jewish community's submission and approbation of the new queen, as well as their hope that they would be protected by the royal couple. Definitely represented a ceremony that insisted on, I would say, complete lordship of the monarchs over the Jews, territorial as well as human, and it applied by definition to the Jews who were to be recognized in these ceremonials as part of the Hungarian entity. Yet at the same time, the reports of the Jewish delegation show that the Jews of Buda were a well-to-do community, and many of them owned expensive gala outfits, including luxury items, and that they possessed and were allowed to bear arms. Let me give you an example of how this really worked well for the benefit of the Jews. In terms of the queen, just going back a bit, the fact that she refuses to kiss it might be seen as something being disrespectful, but this was obviously a choice that she made. She didn't want to show herself subservient to Jewish law. We do see, when we look particularly at papal processions, that it becomes actually more violent. And for a while, the popes were actually dropping the Sefer Torah, or the Torah scroll that had been handed to them. And we see that the Jews have to think about or ensure that they give a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll that is not in any way kosher, that there's something wrong with it. So by dropping it, they're not actually doing something that the Jews might possibly have to fast for as a result of what they're doing. But this is part of the procession. They have to be there. We see them as really taking part and being involved in it as well, and actually taking up what is clearly, I would say, a European tradition of giving whoever is in control of the Jews a Sefer Torah as the most important gift that the Jews can, to show that they are subservient to the rules of the king. Jacob Judah Mendel is recorded in a royal rescript issued by King Ladislaus II that you see here to the city of Pressburg on June the 10th, 1502. And its impetus was repeated attacks by the people of Pazonia, who hurled stones at Jews and physically assaulted them. So here we see one particular prefect trying to stand up for the Jews of Pazonia. He's in this position. Can he stop the violence in the city against the Jews? The city authorities refused to intervene, and even threaten the Jews with imprisonment and fines. The Jews, of course, then turn to their prefect, to Jacob Judah Mendel, who brought the matter to the attention of the king, and in his rescript, the king reminds the city that the Jews have been, as we say here, always and since antiquity under our power, and after our majesty under that of our master, chief treasurer. So I want you to think back to what I said at the beginning. The Jews are all thinking about concretizing their right to be living in Hungary. They found the King Bela 1251 document, and now they're taking part in processions where they're giving the new king and the queen a Sefer Torah as a gift from them. And most firmly orders the city to dare no longer to impose imprisonment or fines on the Jews, but rather to protect the Jews of Pazonia from any illegitimate attackers. And documents such as this make it clear, I think, that the Jewish prefect was the spokesman of the Jews, had access to the king, brought their grievances to the king's attention, and saw to it that injuries they suffered were definitely remedied. But I also want you to see this from the other side of the coin. What are we learning about our Jews of Hungary? We are witnessing a concept of blind patriotism on the part of the Jews, a characteristic that is going to dominate Hungarian and Hungarian Jewish life from the 19th century. So I would say from the next 2 weeks, if you stay with me, you'll really see this leading up, of course, to what we see in the 20th century. It was already developing in the 15th and the 16th centuries. This sense of duty to serve the king above all else. Historical data are lacking, but one wonders to what extent the Mendels were observant Jews in a period and a community where strict observant, Orthodox, I would say, observance was the rule. The role that they were expected to play was essentially little different from that of their predecessors, the non-Jewish judge of the Jews, who were Hungarian noblemen of high rank that I mentioned last week. All of the Mendels, as far as we know, fulfilled their role faithfully, and their functioning redounded, definitely, to the benefit of the Jews. But on the other hand, I would argue that their position places them outside their community. And in my mind, they're very much like the court Jews of 18th century Europe, who handled the finances of royalty and for their services were granted social privileges. So this aspect of Hungarian Jewish life needs to be noticed in terms of what it tells us about Jews and their place in Hungarian society. This is not a simple place to live. What about Jewish women? What can we say about women so far? Well, all in all, Jewish women actually figure with surprising frequency in documents from the 1400s and 1500s, themselves covering financial transactions, usually loans that they made to Christian borrowers. Jewish women worked with their husbands as lenders, but sometimes as individual moneylenders as well. Occasionally, they themselves are listed as heads of households, especially from the 15th century, and as such paid taxes themselves to the royal cities. So are they more active from this period? Well, let's recall our synagogue in Sopron that I mentioned last time. After the Ottoman occupation that I'm going to mention towards the end of this session, the adjoining room of the public synagogue became reserved for women, who are now allowed to observe ceremonies through these narrow openings, a kind of horizontal loophole that we saw last time that reminds us, of course, of medieval Speyer. We also uncover from this time period a Jewish female physician, 3 letters written in 1559 and 1560 by a certain Ferenci Senia Sharval, and from Sharval and from Kerestul that I will mention in particular when we talk about Hasidism, to Palatine Tamas Nadasti and his wife about sending an unnamed Jewish female physician to cure Nadasti's wife. And evidently the fame of this Jewish woman physician had spread beyond the area where she practiced, and her services were even requested by the Palatine, the highest official of the kingdom. So Jewish women are not only being moneylenders, which we would expect them to be if they were married to a moneylender, but also developing their own skills in as being physicians. Which means that we should think about the male Jewish physicians as well, because eventually they are going to become incredibly famous at the beginning of the 20th century. What do they look like a few hundred years earlier? Well, as with many royal heads of all over Europe, the Hungarian kings had their own Jewish personal physician at this time among his other physicians. By the 16th century, most of the Jewish doctors in Hungary had actually studied medicine at the University of Padua, and this was the first European university to admit Jews as students of medicine. Between 1517 and 1690, we know that 80 Jews earned their medical doctorates there. So they are definitely getting a good professional experience and being part of the university. And there's some wonderful work done by David Ruderman on this particular university and the treatment of its Jewish medical students there. What about Jewish scholars? Are there any scholars that we can name from this time? And we're looking for them. Remember last time we really didn't find any particular ones except Kalonymus, and he was only partly in Hungary. What do we find when we come a couple of centuries later? And before I mention them, let us note that compared to the period that preceded it, Jewish life in 15th century Hungary becomes more religious and develops an environment in which Jewish religious scholarship begins to flourish. Hungarian Jews had by this time organized communities with official contact between their congregations, and rabbis functioning in widely dispersed cities with scholarly religious contact between them and the leading rabbinical authorities in other places in Europe. Jewish men in general were able to read Hebrew by this time, obviously an indispensable prerequisite of living a Jewish religious life, and many of them could also write in it at this time. And it seems also that they began to write commercial letters and other notes in Hebrew to one another. They even sign their names in Hebrew in Latin documents that attest to agreements between them and Christian Hungarians. And this sudden upsurge of Jewish scholarship was probably connected to the arrival and settlement in Hungarian communities of learned rabbis from abroad, from countries where by the 15th century Jewish scholarship had a venerable tradition. So now let me give you some names. The first name is Isaac Tremau. He was the first known Jewish author who lived and wrote in Hungary around 1400. Born in Vienna, he moved to the Hungarian city of Nagyszombat, now in western Slovakia, only after completing his Talmudic studies at the feet of several outstanding Austrian rabbinical scholars. Isaac Tremau's teachers were the famous Viennese Talmudist Abraham Klausner, whom he calls his chief teacher, Klausner's brother-in-law, Aaron Weiner of Neustadt, and Sar Shalaman of Weiner Neustadt. And Tremau was in touch with other Jewish scholars as well, and in 1420, shortly before his death, he contacted Jacob Morlin, the Maharil, regarding a divorce case. We know about Tremau because of his Sefer Minhagim that I've put here, his Book of Customs, which was first published in Venice in 1400, which he intended to be a guide for halachically uneducated people to enable them to follow the religious customs of the Jewish year. And as he writes in his preface that since the Black Death of 1348 to 50, which decimated Jewish communities of Germany, scholars became so few that in many places no more than 1 or 2 men remained with any knowledge of the local customs. And he states the following: in his Sefer HaMinhagim, in this work I took note of the religious customs of our country, Hungary, of Styria, which of course is southeast part of Austria, and also in Moravia. And although Rabbi Isaac Timau was the first Jewish author domiciled in Hungary from whom a book has survived, several other Jewish scholars were his contemporaries but left behind no writings. And these rabbis are known only from brief references to them by rabbinical authors who lived outside the borders of Hungary but actually mentioned them. We have here a Nathan of Buda who lived prior to 1427, as mentioned by Rabbi Yaakov Moelin the Maharil. Another was Rabbi Yehuda the Mahari, who also lived in the 15th century, a Rabbi Meir, a Rabbi Kolomon, and a Rabbi Gedel, who may have lived in Sopron. Again, nothing written by these men, but clear that they were considered rabbinical authorities within Hungary. So now, let's move to the fascinating case of a Jewish convert to Christianity in Buda, whose name was Shlomo Schneur. Shlomo Schneur needs to be our example of a prominent and influential Jew of Buda who converts to Christianity. Why is that important? Well, I think you'll understand more if you stay with me. Unfortunately, there were many in Hungary who did this, as there were elsewhere in Europe. Information on Shlomo, as I write here, comes mostly from a rabbinic responsa of 1520, which writes of a Jew called Shlomo Schneur or Schneur Zalman, son of Ephraim, also called himself by the Hungarian name Atel or Etel, who converts to Christianity in Buda and assumes the name Emericus or Imre Fortunatus Sherenchesh. And here you can see him here. All right, let's go back. Just keep this one. With his business acumen, he made himself indispensable to the Palatine Emmerich, the Perenni, the highest administrative dignitary in feudal Hungary, and even established close relations with this Christian high-ranking person. His conversion became such an important issue that it deeply concerned 3 great rabbinic and halachic experts, one in Italy, one in the Ottoman Empire, and one in Poland. Just go back. The 3, as you can see, are listed here. Rabbi Meir ben Yitzchak Katzenelbogen, known as the Maharam from Padua in Italy. The second was the leading rabbinic authority in Eastern Europe, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, known as the Rama from Krakow, Poland. And the third was Rabbi Eliyahu bin Binyamin Halevi from Istanbul, a great legal authority in the Ottoman Empire and in the Sephardi world. Why are they involved? Well, a question was sent to these 3 distinguished rabbis relating to the aliyah to the Torah of Ephraim and Abraham. The aliyah to the Torah, the ability of the sons of this convert to go in the synagogue, to be called up to the reading of the law, which they wanted to do. But these 2 sons, Serenchesh's sons, refused to be called to the Torah by the name of their father because he had converted to Christianity. Ordinarily, of course, the custom among Ashkenazic Jews, as it still is to call the person by his name followed by that of his father. And the issue was compounded by the fact that not only was the apostate father the richest and most influential Jew, or ex-Jew, because he converts, in all of Hungary, but he continued to support the Jews financially and to protect them vis-à-vis the Hungarian authorities, and thus rendering services essential for the very survival of the Jewish community. So I hope you are questioning then whether this was a convert who did not really want to convert to Christianity if he still chooses to support Jews, even though he's now living a Christian life. How else do we explain his good actions after baptism? What is clear is that Abraham and Ephraim did not want to be associated with their father after he had converted. And at the time, the rabbi of Buda, Naphtali Hertz Cohen, or Katz, was in favor of calling them up after the name of their father. And especially when it became clear from the responsa that the converted father actually favored the Jews and performed good deeds for them. The Maharam, Katzenelbogen, showed a similar leaning. The rabbi from Padua stated the following, and this, of course, is obviously translated. All the more so, he says, in this case when we hear that the father of these boys, although he is assimilated among the Gentiles, seeks the welfare of his people and does good to the people who are nearby and far away, personally and with his wealth. From his deeds, we may conclude he has regretted his move to convert and is God-fearing. This is what I heard from trustworthy witnesses, so that we should bring him nearer to us and not drive him away. And therefore I would say, because of the above reasons, we should call the brothers to the Torah as the son of Senior as before. Well, Rabbi Esselis agreed with the decision of Rabbi Katzenelbogen and refrained from giving further reasons. But a short while after these answers were received, the Turks conquered Hungary in what the Hungarians called the Mohawk disaster of 1526, a catastrophic defeat of the Kingdom of Hungary by the Ottoman Empire that led to the country's political fragmentation and occupation. And this event is considered a major turning point, marking the end of independent Hungary as a unified kingdom and paving the way for Ottoman control over much of its territory. The two brothers themselves and other Jews are forced to leave for Istanbul. They join the Hungarian community that gets established in Istanbul until their synagogue was burnt down in 1554. But before that, they again raised the question. The question now was sent to Rabbi Eliyahu ben Binyamin Halevi in Istanbul, where they are. Halevi gives a whole list of reasons why Senior's life should be celebrated, and how time and again he had saved the Jews from more troubles, not just in Buda, but even in a place in Prague at this time. And this is what he writes. This is what Rabbi Eliyahu Halevi of Istanbul wrote a short while about Fortunatus's death. Let me tell you about some of his deeds. So at this point he's died, but the children still don't want to be associated with him when they are called up. It is well known in the community of Buda that there was an informer who wanted to raise an accusation on how the Jews killed a Christian child and hid the blood among the Jews. As soon as the matter was known to Senior, he turned to the king and the ministers, who handed the informer into his hands, and he delivered him to the Jews, who strangled him. He spent a lot of his money to cope with this problem. Rabbi Eliyahu continued. After this event, the rabbis in the communities proclaimed in all the synagogues that whoever calls him an apostate will be punished physically and financially by the leaders. And I want you to see how consistent these rabbis are in trying to protect the name of Senior, even though he's become Christian, because of what he's done for the purpose of the Jewish community. Just go on, because this is a long list. In another case, an evil man from a foreign land took his young son and daughter to Austria, where he and his son and daughter underwent baptism. After his death, Senior had them brought back to Judaism. He spent almost 200 florins. So here we have a long list of things, good deeds that Senior himself has done. And then at the last line, my answer, in my humble opinion, this man is worthy of having his name mentioned with his sons as they are called to the law. And even if some of the activities of Schneur on behalf of the Jews or the Jewish community were exaggerated, and even if some were entirely imaginary, the significance of the account in Halevi, I think, is obvious. Those who told him about Schneur, and they must have been Hungarian Jews, thought very highly of him and were determined to depict a repentant Jew who provided help to the Jews even when his own life was at risk. So we need to appreciate that Schneur himself was an important Jew. But he seems to have got himself into trouble by having had an affair with a Christian woman and decided to be baptized in order to escape punishment for being a Jew and for having sex with a Christian woman, which was not allowed. Undoubtedly, Serensheshes made mistakes in the service of King Laios II that you see here. And it seems too that he was strongly criticized by his rivals regarding his financial work in the service of the king and had been in prison for trying to debase coinage. But on the other hand, what it shows us is that this idea of somebody being a representative who does good for the Jews is somebody who is seen eternally, whatever they do in their later life. And this is something that the Jews clearly felt very, very connected to Schneur and what he'd done in his high position for the Jews of Hungary. So at this point, we need to turn to the division of Hungary as a result of this Battle of Mohawk that I mentioned before. It was fought on August the 29th, 1526. The battle was swift, resulting in the death of King Laios II and most of his nobility. The Ottomans had defeated the Hungarians and were coming west. And so Hungary is divided. For us in particular, Buda passes to the Ottomans and Royal Hungary makes Pozonia its capital. And let us recall who the Ottomans were. Well, they're Turkish nomads who had already begun migrating into Asia Minor in the mid-13th century. They proclaimed their own Ottoman Empire under Sultan Osman I in 1301. They expanded rapidly through the remnants of the Byzantine Empire in the 14th century. The fall of Constantinople of Istanbul in 1453 was more significant, I think, psychologically than militarily. But here, a series of sultans rebuilt the old city into the capital of the new empire and religion, which they considered as fully and dominantly a part of Europe as the old Roman Empire had been. The Sultan cum Emperor, Mehmed II the Conqueror, pushes north immediately after seizing Constantinople. And maybe we can sense the fear of people living in Hungary as to what it would mean when the Muslims really come west. The Turks took Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Herzegovina, Montenegro, and the entire territory around the Black Sea by 1499. Under Suleiman I, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, the Ottomans once more turned towards Europe with a terrifying, rapid advance through Habsburg and Venetian territories in the 1520s, Belgrade, 1521, Rhodes, 1522, fell. King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia were defeated and killed with many of his knights, as we've said, at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. And by the end of the decade, the Ottoman armies had Vienna under siege. And over the course of his reign, Selim II, the Magnificent, would capture Budapest in 1541, absorb much of Hungary in 1547, expand east into Iraq in 1533, and west along the North African coast to Algiers, to Tunis and Tripoli, giving the Ottomans control of much of the Mediterranean. And when King Francis I of France, that you see here, who ruled between 1515 and 1547, made an alliance with the Ottomans, the alliance shocked the Christian world but its realpolitik cynicism also recognized that the Ottomans were now integrally part of European politics. An ambivalence settled in. Some saw the Turks as a threat and a divine punishment, but others considered them wealthy, powerful, and cultured allies. Travelers praised their efficiency, the cleanliness of their cities, their apparently fair regimes, and what seemed like an administration based on merit rather than birth. But what made this evil other terrifying was the fact that in some respects it was not an other at all. The most feared Ottoman troops were the Janissaries, these young Christian boys aged between 8 and 20, who from the 1390s were taken from conquered territories in a regular quota system and converted to Islam, trained in Constantinople to become the personal bodyguards and most dedicated soldiers of the Sultan. Many Jews, as we know, moved to the Ottoman Empire and rose to prominent positions in trade, finance, administration, and the professions, and not only from Hungary, but from other places, in many ways escaping Christianity, escaping the Inquisition. Ottoman Empire was a place where Jews knew they could live openly as Jews. So how they think of the Ottomans who come into Hungary is something we need to consider. For the Ottomans, this was entirely normal part of their history and practice of going to a new land and conquering it. For European Christians, more attuned to a cosmic battle of good versus evil, which emphasized the importance of differences of race and religion, it was deeply unsettling. Historic Hungary now is divided into 3 parts, among which there were tensions, enmity, and even armed clashes most of the time. Part 1, the Ottomans took the central and southern parts of Hungary, achieving the deepest Ottoman penetration, as I say here, into Christian Europe to date. As far north as the cities of Vac and Miskolc were under Ottoman rule, with the Pasha of Buda as the governor of the entire Hungarian province. And then you have part 2, which was leaving this small Habsburg client kingdom bordering Austria to the north. This became Royal Hungary, in effect a Habsburg province. And then you had this large Transylvanian principality on the left of the map with its own diet to the east of Hungary. The only one of the 3 where a semblance of independence survived was this eastern part, the Principality of Transylvania that you see here in orange, Erdély in Hungarian, recognized by the Ottomans as this quasi-vassal state and ruled by a succession of Hungarian Transylvanian princely houses. Transylvania was a historical strip of land in these Carpathian mountains that had often changed hands already. Let's first turn to our Jews in the Ottoman area. How does this change in rule and division in Hungary affect our Jews? Well, now the central part of Hungary would be under the Turkish rule for 160 years, from 1526 to 1689. In the early years after Moha, the Ottoman army behaved like all conquering armies, killing and destroying. Whether the people they encountered on their way were Christians or Jews made no difference. They were the enemy, and they thought they had to be eliminated. The capital city and fortress of Buda fell to the Turks in September 1526. According to the Swiss humanist Johann Kessler, what happened was that in September 1526, when the Turks penetrated Buda, they killed all the Christians, men, women, and children. Then they attacked the Jewish street, which was protected within the city by special walls and fortifications, and the Jews themselves tried to defend it with a lot of vigor until and in fact, the Turks lost 2,500 men in taking it. In Pech, lying only a few miles west of Moha, the Turks slaughtered the entire Jewish population. But once this first frenzy of conquest was over, the Ottoman penchant returned for peacefully controlling subject populations and definitely providing them with security. From Buda, the Turks transported some 2,000 Jews of the city and its environs to Istanbul and other cities of the Ottoman Empire. There, Hungarian Jews established themselves as separate communities, preserved their Hungarian identity and customs for several generations, until they gradually, of course, assimilated to the pre-existing Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities. And it was not until 1541 that the Turks definitely established themselves in Buda and made it the capital of their newly won Hungarian province. The Jews who remained in Turkish Hungary had synagogues and rabbis, but were deficient definitely in producing any scholarly or literary works until they were really able to feel comfortable again. Most of them were engaged now in trading, played an important role in the commerce between various regions of the Ottoman Empire on the one hand, and the Western Christian countries, where some of their fellow Jews were still living on the other. And during the decades of Turkish rule in central Hungary, the Jewish communities achieved a degree of economic well-being that enabled them to lend their support to the charitable institutions of the Jews in the Holy Land. Often by emissaries coming to them and requesting money, they would have it then, they would take it back to the Jewish communities. They could travel freely all over the Ottoman Empire, and their rabbis corresponded in halakhic matters with colleagues in Istanbul, in Salonika, whose superior expertise they ungrudgingly recognized. Now, Sephardi Jewish doctors in the service of high Turkish officials began to make more of an appearance in Hungary. But let us not forget that to be the personal physician of a Turkish sultan was not without attendant dangers. In 1566, when the 76-year-old Sultan Suleiman died while his army was laying siege to Svijetar, his Jewish physician was with him and was put to death by strangling. The defeat of the Turkish army at Vienna on October the 12th, 1683, was the beginning of the end of Turkish rule in Hungary. At that time, the total population of the twin cities of Pest and Buda was 28,000, of whom about only 1,000 were Jews. For the Jews, the replacement of Ottomans by Austrian rule meant a marked deterioration in their position, culminating in many places of expulsion. But more of this next time. What about royal Hungary? What happens to the Jews who were living there? Well, without a king of Hungary, the royal cities of Pazonia and Sopron, now Sopron actually becomes the capital, they decide to get rid of the Jews, whose financial strength as a result of their mercantile relations with the West had, as we know, been considerable. The citizens of Pazonia applied to Queen Maria and obtained her permission to expel the Jews, provided they let the Jews sell their houses and take their money with them. The citizens, however, managed to present these transactions, and the Jews had to depart without any money. And the expulsion of the Jews from these two most important West Hungarian cities was a heavy blow to the Jewish community of Royal Hungary, but it entailed only financial losses and other practical hardships. Much more tragic, and unfortunately a more common occurrence in Royal Hungary involving the loss of 30 Jewish lives, was a blood libel that happened in 1520 in Bazin. It was initiated by Ferenc or Francis Wolf, the Count of Pozing, and Sven Georgi, who sought a way out of having to repay his sizable debts to the Jews of Bazin and Maček. 30 Jews of Bazin were apprehended, among them the leaders of the community, children and 2 pregnant women. The city council subjected them to interrogation, and on the basis of confessions extorted by cruel torture, all of them were condemned to death and burned at the stake. The remaining Jews were summarily expelled from the city. In the meantime, the boy whose murder the Jews were accused of was found, as happens, I would say, in 99% of these situations, and it turned out that the Count himself had had the child hidden. Thereafter, no Jews lived in Bazin until the middle of the 19th century. In 1536, the burghers of Natzambat decided that they too would get rid of their debts to the Jews by raising another blood libel against them. They accused the Jews of having killed for ritual purposes a small child who had disappeared 2 years earlier. The Jew Moses was tortured on the rack until he confessed, but of course he confessed because he was tortured and he wasn't speaking the truth. Expulsions of Jews or restrictions of their rights of residence to certain limited areas and localities continued in this royal Hungary during this period. But then, if we think about what's happening in the third space, this gives us a full picture of how Jews were coping with what was happening in Hungary. Whether Jews lived in Transylvania prior to the 16th century is unknown. The first reference to their presence is found in the documents of the 1578 Transylvanian Diet of Kolozsvár, which stated, "Never before have so many such like Greeks and even Jews entered the city as in those days." In general, the Transylvanian princes related to the Jews under their rule with the same mixture of benevolence and exploitation that had long characterized the attitude of the Hungarian kings to their Jews. The Jews were allowed to practice their religion, to take money out of the country, or to emigrate from there if needs be. And what we know about the Jews there in Transylvania is that they worked particularly in the import business. So this division of Hungary into three leaves us with the definite impression that Jewish life was least difficult once the Turks had established themselves and finished massacring, that this was the place where Jews preferred to live. Somewhat more so maybe in Transylvania, and most difficult with the ever-present danger of persecution and blood libel in royal Hungary. For one thing, while in royal Hungary the Jews were several times expelled from this or that city, and in Transylvania their right to settle was severely restricted. Once the Ottomans had legitimated their control, no such expulsions or restrictions took place in Turkish Hungary. Next time, we will move to the long 19th century and study this fascinating infiltration of Hasidism into Hungary versus an emancipating Jews who are interested in really finally assimilating. And this tension between the two is something that is so fascinating in this long history of the Jews of Hungary. So thank you once again for joining me.